For centuries, two empires dominated the edges of the known world. In the west, Rome. In the east, China. Both achieved a scale of power, sophistication, and ambition that has rarely been repeated in history. Rome extended its influence from Britain to Egypt, from Hispania to the gates of Persia. China, under the Han dynasty, unified its territory, expanded its borders to Central Asia, and became the cultural, economic, and military heart of the East. The most fascinating thing is that these two colossi coexisted at the same time. Rome and China were active and at their peak simultaneously for over 200 years. There are even records of indirect attempts at contact between the two empires, through embassies, rumors, and trade exchanges along the Silk Road. And that leaves us with an irresistible question. What would have happened if they had faced each other in an all-out war? What would happen if the legions of Rome marched against the Chinese imperial army? An impossible battle, but not entirely unthinkable. Today we're going to compare forces, analyze their strengths and weaknesses, and outline the scenario of a war that, although it never happened, could have changed world history. At its height, Rome was not just a territorial empire. It was a perfectly calibrated military machine. The Roman army was made up of professional legions, trained for years and formed under iron discipline. Each legion had about 5,000 to 6,000 men, divided into smaller units called cohorts and centuries, which allowed for enormous tactical flexibility on the battlefield. But beyond organization, Rome had an even more powerful weapon: its experience. They had been at war for centuries. Against tribes, Hellenistic kingdoms, Carthaginians, Parthians, Germans. Each enemy forced Rome to adapt, to evolve, to perfect its techniques. The typical Roman legionary was armed with the gladius, a short sword for close combat, a large rectangular shield, scutum, and one or two javelins, pilum, designed to break on impact, making it difficult for the enemy to return them. Tactically, Roma was noted for its ability to maintain formations even under extreme pressure. The famous testudo formation protected soldiers with a shield wall against enemy projectiles. And when it came to taking a city or setting up a fortified camp, Rome also did it with almost obsessive precision. In addition, the empire had a unique infrastructure for its time. Paved roads that allowed for rapid troop movement, an imperial messaging system, and a logistics network that allowed them to supply armies far from home. Rome was aggressive, expansionist, brutal, and in military terms, one of the most lethal cogs in ancient history. But was that enough to defeat a rival of China's size and complexity? While it was imposing its power in the West, on the other side of the world another giant was flourishing: the Han Empire. At its height, the Han dynasty ruled over tens of millions of people, probably more than the entire Roman Empire combined, stretching from the Yellow Sea to the borders of Central Asia. But it was not just a large empire. It was a highly organized empire, with a solid bureaucracy, detailed censuses, and a logistical apparatus that allowed for the mobilization of resources on a large scale. And yes, he also had a formidable army. Unlike the Roman professional model, the Han army combined career soldiers with peasant recruits trained for periods. This allowed China to raise huge armies quickly, albeit with a somewhat more variable level of discipline. Their weapons were effective and, in some respects, more advanced than those of the Romans. Han soldiers used composite bows, halberds, spears, and above all, crossbows. These were powerful weapons that required little physical strength to fire, and could pierce armor at a distance. Furthermore, they were mass-produced using standardized methods. The cavalry was also key. China mastered the use of light cavalry, especially useful in open terrain, and essential for fighting nomadic peoples like the Xiongnu. And although there is no evidence that gunpowder was used in warfare during this time, explosive substances were already being experimented with in alchemical contexts. Scientific development was part of imperial power. But beyond weapons, what made the Han army fearsome was its logistical and defensive capabilities. They could erect fortifications quickly, move troops over great distances, and keep a large army supplied even during prolonged campaigns. In short, if Rome was a sharp sword, China was a mobile wall, capable of defending and counterattacking with lethal force. The question is, what would happen if these two powers collided on neutral territory? That Rome and China never directly confronted each other. But what if they had? Historically, the two empires were closer than we usually think. Indirect embassies were sent along the Silk Road. Rome knew of a distant land called Serica, famous for producing silk. And China had heard of a powerful empire to the west, which some texts vaguely identify as Qin. But there was never formal contact. So to imagine a conflict, we have to build a realistic scenario. First, where? A war between Rome and China would only have been possible if both powers had expanded their territories into Central Asia. Perhaps somewhere in present-day Iran, Afghanistan, or Kazakhstan, where trade routes could cause disputes. Second, when? The most likely period would be between the 1st century BC and the 2nd century AD, when both powers reached their maximum power. Augustus and Trajan in Rome, Wu and Guangwu in China. Third, how? Rome would have had to advance far beyond its eastern limits, possibly after defeating the Parthian Empire. China, for its part, would have had to push even further west, facing hostile climates and extremely warlike nomadic peoples. Such a war would not be quick. It would be a grueling campaign, lasting months or years, with extended fronts and very fragile supply lines. The battle would not take place in the glorious cities of Rome or Chang'an, but on dusty plains, mountain passes, and makeshift fortresses in remote lands. Armies would not only fight each other, but also against terrain, hunger, and disease. In that scenario, each empire would have advantages and disadvantages. And that's exactly what we'll see in the next part. Now that we have the stage, the big question comes. Now that we have the stage, the big question comes. Who would have the advantage on the battlefield? The Roman legions were famous for their discipline. They could maintain formations under extreme conditions, maneuver with surgical precision, and respond quickly to complex orders. In close combat, the Roman legion was a fearsome force. The Han army, on the other hand, relied on its versatility, mixed units, good cavalry, and the extensive use of crossbows capable of hitting before enemy infantry even approached. In a war of attrition, with skirmishes and sieges, China had experience and resilience. Rome dominated close combat with its gladius, the pilum, and the coordinated use of shields. China mastered long-range warfare, missiles, bows, defensive traps, rudimentary artillery, and standardized weapons for mass production. Both empires had access to metals, advanced engineering, and complex strategies. But the way they were applied was different. Rome crushed. China surrounded. Here, the Chinese had the advantage. The Han bureaucratic network could mobilize armies over thousands of kilometers and supply them through complex land routes. Rome was good at moving troops within its territory, but outside its borders, it relied too heavily on continuous conquest to sustain itself. This could be the most decisive factor. A campaign in Central Asia would be brutal for both sides. Deserts, high plateaus, extreme winters, and regions controlled by hostile tribes. But while the Han army was already accustomed to operating in such environments in wars against the Xiongnu, for example, Rome would have had to quickly adapt to completely new terrain, with a heavier and less flexible army. Rome was aggressive, imperialist, expansionist. China, on the other hand, was defensive, calculating, willing to resist and wear down the enemy. A prolonged war would favor the Han. A swift and direct campaign could favor Rome, if they could maintain supplies. With all this, we can now approach the final question. Who would have really won? We'll answer that in the last part. Logistics and military culture, we come to the question everyone wants to answer. Would Rome have won, or China? And the truth is this: it depends. If we imagine a quick war, led by an expanding Rome, with well-organized legions attacking in open fields, without the need to maintain long supply lines, it is possible that Rome obtained a tactical victory. His experience crushing smaller armies and his ability to quickly establish fortified positions could give him an initial advantage. But that scenario is unlikely, because China was not a minor kingdom or a scattered civilization. It was an empire with one of the most efficient bureaucracies in history, a superior logistical capability, large armies, and a military approach designed to resist, absorb, and strike back. A real war in intermediate territory would have been long and exhausting. And there, Rome would have been at a disadvantage. Far from its imperial center, without territorial control, surrounded by hostile tribes. And depending on fragile supply lines, Rome would have had to maintain thousands of men in a land it did not know. While China, more adapted to this type of conflict, could use its territory, its transportation network, and its mobilization capacity to resist any invasion. Furthermore, there is one factor that cannot be ignored: purpose. Rome fought for conquest. China, for preserving order. In a war of expansion, the empire fighting to defend its civilization is usually more determined. So who would have won? The most reasonable answer is no one, or both. Rome and China were such different empires in geography, philosophy, and strategy that directly opposing them would have weakened them both, without a clear victory. Maybe that's why history kept them apart. Because each one was, in his time and place, the true center of the world he knew. And perhaps the only way to survive was to never cross paths.